beginning of the 18th century for the Russian Empire is the era of Tsar Peter the Great, a man who sought to turn backward and retrograde Muscovy into a mighty modern state of the European format. The state and church reforms were implemented by a team from Ukraine, in particular the well-known intellectuals of that time, Theophan Prokopovich and Stefan Yavoysky. Yet one of the wisest advisors to Tsar Peter the Great was the Ukrainian hetman Ivan Mazepa. The Ukrainian Cossack state was under the protectorate of the Moscow Tsar, but the old hetman had a decisive influence on the young Tsar.
Мазепа сподівався реформувати Московію за своїми рецептами, з тим, щоб українській державі було комфортно
Mazepa hoped to reform Muscovy in his own recipes, so that the Ukrainian state would feel comfortable under the scepter of Peter the Great. However, later the hetman was convinced that the mentality of Russians did not allow for bringing Muscovy to the standards of European civilization. So when the war came to Ukraine in 1708, and the Russian Tsar refused to provide military assistance, it became for hetman Mazepa the final nail in the coffin of his patience. He abandoned allied relations with Russia and reinstated Khmelnytsky's allied treaty with the Swedish kingdom. However, under the Swedish protectorate, the Ukrainian state lasted only for around 6 months. The allies, hetman Ivan Mazepa and King Karl XII of Sweden, suffered a crushing defeat from the Russians in the Battle of Poltava. After this, the hetman's government was forced to leave Ukraine and go into exile in the territory of the Ottoman Empire. This was when the next period of the political and diplomatic struggle for the restoration of the Ukrainian state began.
За весь час її історії проглядалася державницька політика, створення власної держави.
Throughout our history, one can trace the policy concerning the creation of our own state. The leaders were not always able to do this because there were quite a number of conflicts with Poland, the Lithuanian Principality. We were simply squeezed into very tight economic and territorial boundaries in order that we would not be able to create our state.
Не спромоглися створити свою державу.
There were many diverse moments. There were no longer the classical military movements like in the old Cossack Ukraine, but these were already movements that brought Ukraine to the path of the modern revolutions and eventually led it to a new struggle for Ukrainian independence and its rise as a free state. After the Battle of Poltava, Tsar Peter the Great went in pursuit of Mazepa, but fell into the encirclement of the Ottoman army on the Prut River, and there he was forced to sign the shameful Prut Treaty in 1711, according to which he completely abandoned the claims of domination over the Ukrainian Cossack state. However, having let Peter the Great out of captivity, the Ottomans allowed him to go through a punitive expedition on Ukrainian lands. Thus, the deportation of the population of the right bank Ukraine, which was forcibly relocated to the left bank of the Dnipro River in regions under the control of Russia. The center of state resistance of Cossack Ukraine, the Zaporizhian Sich, was obliterated by Russian troops. Spontaneous Cossack uprisings broke out throughout Ukraine. The successor of Ivan Mazepa, the newly elected hetman Pilip Orlik, was guided by the insurgent movement. Hetman Pilip Orlik, who then began the Liberation War, which entered into the textbooks of history by the name of the Uprising of Verlan, although in fact it was a war of liberation under the leadership of Hetman Pilip Orlik, which began in 1734. The main fighting ended in 1738–39. In fact, it ended only with his death in 1742. So this liberation war was not successful, because there was not a sufficient military force to fend off the enemy, and there was very little support of the people. There was no support primarily due to the fact that there was almost no population on the right bank lands. Russia turned the densely populated Kiev, Cherkasy Oblast, and other Cossack lands into some kind of new wild field. The failure of Orlik incited the wrath of the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, and in 1713 he signed an Adrianople peace treaty with the Polish Commonwealth. Under this agreement, the right bank Ukraine was in fact reoccupied by the Poles.
Всі Всі подальші спроби
All further attempts to restore Ukrainian statehood in the years 1750 to 52, when under the leadership of the leader of the Zaporizhian siege Kosh Ataman Vasil Sich and the hetman of the Hans Ukraine Marko Mamai, 2/3 of the territory claimed by the Zaporizhian army was liberated. Later, this attempt was unfortunately repelled, and then came the next attempt in the form of uprising of the mercenary Cossacks, known as Koliyivshchina. The Hans Ukraine is hardly mentioned even by Ukrainian historians. However, the Crimean Hans and later the Ottoman Sultans were often loyal allies to the Cossacks, especially when it came to the confrontation with a third party, as with the Commonwealth of Poland and Lithuania, or the Moscow Principality. So it is not surprising that after defeating the Battle of Poltava, Hetman Ivan Mazepa, along with his government, ended up on the lands of the Ottoman Empire.
Туди ж перейшли
The remains of the Zaporizhian army after Peter I destroyed the Sich was transferred to these lands as well. The Cossacks even founded a new Oleshki Sich on these lands. In the Hans Ukraine, there was no serfdom and the only tax was a tithe to the hetman treasury. So it was precisely on these territories that our state traditions were nurtured, and it was there that leaders of the anti-Polish and anti-Moscow revolts in our lands emerged from.
двома імперіями.
According to one version of modern historians, the group of saboteurs from the Hans Ukraine inspired the Cossack peasant uprising of 1768 to 69, which entered into history under the name of Koliyivshchina. From a spontaneous anti-Polish rebellion, the uprising quickly turned into a struggle for the restoration of the Ukrainian state. Even a new Ukrainian hetman was elected. After the capture of Uman, the insurgents proclaimed the restoration of Ukrainian statehood, and the universals of the Ukrainian state began to be published. And it was then that Maxim Zalizniak was declared the new hetman of the Ukrainian state. However, this period of the liberation struggle failed. The Commonwealth of Poland and Lithuania would not be able to overcome the insurgents on the lands of the right bank Ukraine. But the Russians sent to them military assistance so that the national liberation struggle of Ukrainians could not overthrow on the left bank of the Dnipro River, controlled by the Russian Empire. The Russians acted cunningly. They operated under the guise of the Allies, invited the leaders of the uprising to their camp, and the latter were arrested. Some of the leaders later were handed over to the Poles, while others were simply exiled to prison camps in Siberia. However, the uprising of Ukrainians against the empires did not stop. A new stage in the liberation struggle began when the Russian Empress Catherine II repeatedly and finally destroyed the Zaporizhian Sich and forbade the status of a Cossack as a noble person. Since then, no one within the Russian Empire, under the fear of imminent death, had the right to be called a Cossack or a Zaporizhian. The uprising reignited on the left bank after the liquidation of the Zaporizhian siege in 1775. After that, there was a known uprising under the leadership of Kuzma Harkusha, which covered almost all of the left bank lands. Then there was an uprising under the leadership of Vasil Zhuba. During the times of Catherine II, the Zaporizhian Cossacks were destroyed in 1775. That is, hetmanate was abolished, and this is the exact day of the liquidation of Ukrainian statehood. So we cannot say that Ukraine did not exist, because it did. Even before the end of the 18th century, it existed. And if we talk about the fact that even under Tsarina Yelizaveta, hetmanate was restored with Rozumovsky as hetman, so it is very clearly possible to say that this was the factual restoration of Ukrainian statehood. The 19th century was the period of the greatest decline of Ukrainian statehood. All references to our state tradition were totally destroyed to the point that Russians perceived it as an artificial formation, invented in the bowels of the Austro-Hungarian General Staff. They thought that there was no Ukrainian nation, no Ukrainian language, and that such a state had never existed. There was only some Malorussia or Little Russia inhabited by the Russian sub-ethnos, which communicated in a dialect that was a mix of the Russian and Polish languages. Is that really true? And what in reality was a province of the Russian Empire named Malorussia?
Тому що Мала Польща – це той етногенетичний пупок, звідки виникла Велика Польща.
Malopolska, or Small Poland, is the ethnogenetic navel from where Great Poland and the Wielkopolska state arose. Small Greece is Athens, Sparta, which then became Great Greece. So what is Malorussia, Little Russia? As academician Hrushevsky wrote, this term was first mentioned in the 14th century and meant that this was a matter of the original territory of the same ethnogenetic navel from which the state-nation of the period of Kievan Rus arose.
З якого виникла державна нація Русі часів Київського періоду.
So the irony of fate is that it is precisely since the period of the greatest decline of the state tradition from the province of Malorussia, which Moscow considered to be the same as the Voronezh or Ural province, that the Ukrainian national spirit and then the corresponding organizational structures experienced a rebirth. The ideological basis for national revival was introduced by intellectuals of the era of Romanticism. In the 19th century, the Russian aristocracy, originated from Ukraine, began to admire the Cossack antiquity, to hang portraits of the hetmans on the walls of their rooms, sing sad Ukrainian songs in the cherry gardens, and became interested in folk history.
Згодом найрадикальніші
Later, the most radical ones were united in the movement of chlopomans, refined aristocrats dressed in peasant clothing, and began walking to the people. From this form of entertainment, eventually illegal clubs began to appear. The first of them was the Cyril-Methodius Brotherhood, which began to develop the concept of an autonomous and eventually a completely independent Ukraine. But this is a subject for the next program. So always remember that every phenomenon has its own good and bad sides. It's pro et contra.
Contra.